back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is Magic Rules you might be getting wrong. And today I'm going to be talking about replacement effects. But as usual, before I get to the main topic, I'm going to tackle some of your guys' questions. Giovanni Juarez says, I would like to know how to use or pay for using Crackle with Power with Hanata in play. I don't really understand how much do I have to pay and how much damage can I cause. Okay, well, let's look at those cards. Crackle with Power is XXX red sorcery. Crackle with Power deals 5 times X damage to each of up to X targets. And Hanata says spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each target. And funny enough, I did a deck doctor for one of my patrons recently that was a Hanata deck. They had Crackle with Power in there. And as I was talking about it, I thought Crackle with Power was a great fit, but really it's not. When you're building a Hanata deck, what you want more than anything is X spells with only 1 X in their cost, because the more X's you have, the worse it gets, or the less that Hanata will help with casting that spell, right? If you have a spell that only has 1 X in its casting cost and targets a whole bunch of things, essentially what Hanata will do will just allow you to target as many things as you want, because every target that you add reduces the cost by 1, so it lets you target as many things as you want. Really is a fantastic commander. So with Crackle with Power, essentially what Hanata will do will reduce only 1 X. So if you target 3 things with Crackle with Power, it's going to cost 3X. So that's going to be 9 plus the red in the red. It's going to be 11. Hanata says it's reducing by 1 for each target. You've targeted 3 things. So instead of paying 11, you're going to pay 8. Still a lot of mana, right? So essentially what you want to do with Hanata is find X spells that target things. That's the best option to go, but you don't want multiple X's, because Hanata is basically going to be reducing your cost by whatever 1 X is. All right, the next question, Pokalicious Enchill, and I actually pulled this question off of my 5 cards that you see more commander play video where I talked about Assault Suit, and they said, can't your opponents equip Assault Suit onto their own creature and attack you with your own creature and essentially permanently gain control of Assault Suit? So this one I added in here because it is a common misconception that people make all the time, okay? When you gain control of a creature that is equipped, you do not gain control of the equipment on that creature. The original owner of the equipment still controls the equipment. So for example, if you gain control of my commander and I have a Sword of the Animist attached to my commander, I still control the Sword of the Animist and I can still re-equip it. Yes, the Sword of the Animist is still equipped to my commander. It still gets the +1/+1, but when you attack, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle, and the you in here refers to me. It's my equipment, I control it. So if you steal my commander and attack with it, I get to go search for a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped, not you, because that's still my equipment. Same goes for auras, right? Auras and equipment work the same way. Whoever is the controller of that card is the one that is getting the effect, right? When I cast an aura on an opponent's creature, I still control that aura. It's mine, even though I've cast it on someone else's creature. Now, of course, you can't re-equip right away. You got to wait till your turn because you can only equip at sorcery speed. So if someone steals my creature that has an equipment on it, probably they're doing it on their turn. So I got to wait until my turn before I can then re-equip that equipment to one of my creatures. Nevertheless, though, I still do control it while it's on the creature that they've stolen. So with the Assault Suit, every time your opponents gain control of your creature that has the Assault Suit on it, you are not allowed to re-equip it to one of your creatures. It's mine. I'm the only one that gets to activate that ability. All right, and one more question from Luxorcist, who actually has 2 questions. 1, what does resolve mean? And at what point do things resolve? And 2, what does it mean to copy a spell you control? So some pretty basic things here. First of all, what does resolve mean? Honestly, that's a question that is very basic in the game that I'm not sure I have the greatest answer for, but essentially what happens is you cast a spell, it goes on the stack, and after you cast that spell, you have to wait for all your opponents to respond to it. You have to give them an opportunity, and after they have done so, that spell will resolve, which means its effects will happen, right? So if I have a lightning bolt, for example, that's going to do 3 damage to any target. My opponents have an ability to respond to it. Now, of course, if they counter it, it will not resolve, right? That effect won't happen. It'll just go to the graveyard. But assuming that doesn't happen, that means my spell will resolve once everyone has past priority, and when it resolves, the effect happens and my card goes to the graveyard. If it's an instant or sorcery, it goes directly to the graveyard unless there's some other effect like rebound that happens, in which case it'll go to exile. If it's a permanent spell, of course, it will resolve by going to the battlefield. So resolve means its effect just happens, right? The same goes with abilities. Any ability that goes on the stack, the exact same thing will happen. It'll go to the stack, my opponents can respond to it, maybe they can counter it with a stifle type of effect. If they don't, it will then resolve, which means that effect, whatever it is, will just occur. Now, what does it mean to copy a spell you control? Well, what it means is you have a spell, and again, you have to control it, which means you cast it. A spell you control is a spell that you cast. Unless, and there are some situations where you can gain control of spells, right? Maybe your opponents cast a spell, you can actually use some cards to gain control of an opponent's spell, which of course then means you control it. That is rare. Usually a spell you control is a spell that you've cast, and then once you've cast it, you probably need to hold priority. Again, you can visit my stack video where I talk about how the stack works and holding priority and all of that. So if I want to copy one of my own spells, and you give the example of double major here, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to cast my spell, I'm going to hold priority, and then I'm going to cast the double major so that I can copy the spell that I just cast. And then of course, I will then give my opponents all the opportunity to respond to what I'm doing. I hope that was clear enough and explained it. All right, let's get to the topic of today, which is replacement effects. And a replacement effect, really important, happens a lot in a commander game, probably more than you would think. And basically the name says it all. A replacement effect is an effect that is replacing something that would normally happen, I guess. So let's look at a popular card in the format, Aven Mind Sensor. 2 and a white, bird wizard, 2/1, flash and flying. If an opponent would search a library, that player searches the top 4 cards of that library instead. That is a replacement effect. So you are taking an effect that would normally happen and you are replacing it with something else. Almost always what you're going to see is if and instead. Those are the important words that you're looking for. If this thing would happen, instead, this other thing is going to happen, right? So if your opponents are searching through their library with a rampant growth, that's an effect that is searching your opponent's library. Instead, they're only going to look at the top 4 cards of their library instead of looking through their entire library, right? This is replacing what would normally happen. Let's look at abundance. 2 green, green enchantment. If you would draw a card, you may instead choose land or non-land. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of the chosen kind and put it into your hand. So this is a replacement effect. It is replacing your draw, right? So if you would draw a card, and that card draw could be for any reason. It could be on your normal draw step. It could be because you have a heuristic study. Any draw effect, this can replace because this is a may, right? And sometimes replacement effects will be a may, which means you can do them if you want to, or you can just forego doing them. Sometimes they will always be turned on and you won't have an option. In this case, if you would draw a card, you may choose land or non-land instead. And again, the really important part here with replacement effects is you are replacing the draw. You aren't actually drawing a card if an abundance is being used, right? So if you have something that says, whenever you draw a card, such and such a thing happens, that won't happen if you use your abundance because you aren't actually drawing a card. The draw is being replaced by revealing cards from your library and putting them into your hand. Another important thing to note here, and there are lots of cards that do this, revealing cards from your library and then putting them into your hand is not a draw. You're only drawing a card unless it actually says draw on it. Speaking of which, let's look at Alms Collector. 3 and a white, cat cleric, 3/4 with flash. If an opponent would draw 2 or more cards, instead you and that player each draw a card. So again, this is looking for a specific scenario where if an opponent would draw 2 or more cards. So whenever that happens, this is going to replace that action, right? So instead of your opponent drawing 2 cards, you and that player are each going to draw 1 card. This is replacing what would normally happen. And of course, it's open-ended so that if your opponent draws 10 cards, now instead, you and that player are each going to draw 1 card. It doesn't matter how many cards are being drawn here. As long as it is 2 or more, it's going to fulfill this. And instead, you and that player each draw a card. Of course, this has to happen all at once though, right? If your opponent has a heuristic study out, it triggers, they draw a card off of it, and then it triggers again and they draw a card off of it. Those are 2 separate instances of drawing a card. That is not going to trigger your Alms Collector. Those are each 1 card draws all to themselves. This has to be 1 action, 1 effect that is drawing 2 or more cards. Important to note there. Let's look at a couple of cards here, Leyline of the Void and Planar Void. So Leyline of the Void says, if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. Planar Void says, whenever another card is put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile that card. So these two cards are doing very similar things. However, one of them is a replacement effect and one of them is not. And again, this is why this is so very important when you look for the proper wording. Both of these cards are graveyard hate. They're going to be exiling things from graveyards. Planar Void, though, however, is not a replacement effect. You look at Leyline of the Void, it's got that important wording, if and instead. So that means it is replacing the effect of something going to your graveyard. Planar Void is not. And that can be very important in certain decks. For example, a Lenda deck, where I used to play this card, Planar Void was a perfect fit because it allowed things to go to the graveyard and then get exiled, right? It's not a replacement effect. So if your Lenda died, instead of putting it in the command zone, you would allow it to go to the graveyard, because back then the dies rule was different with commanders. You had to let them go to the graveyard in order to get a dies trigger. So Planar Void was a perfect fit there. You would let your commander go to the graveyard, you would get the dies trigger, you would get all those tokens, and then the card would get exiled from your graveyard and you could put it back in the command zone. Leyline of the Void, on the other hand, does not allow dies triggers. Nothing is actually hitting the graveyard, for your opponents anyway, right? If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So nothing is actually hitting the graveyard. So if your opponent is playing that Marin deck, they're going to be in big trouble because nothing is actually going to hit their graveyard. They're not going to get any dies triggers. They're not going to get any experience. All of that stuff has been replaced by this effect. One more thing I want to talk about here that isn't necessarily a replacement effect, but sort of fits into the same category, is cards like Teferi's Protection and Platinum Empyrean that say your life total can't change. Now that isn't actually a replacement effect, but it does work in the same way, and there are some very interesting interactions that will happen here, okay? So let's just look at Platinum Empyrean. All that says is your life total can't change. Now, just because your life total can't change doesn't mean you can't take damage, right? So if I have a creature with lifelink that I am flying in with, I'm going to connect, and your life total can't change, but the damage that I am dealing still is technically being done, so I will still gain life off of it. The damage is essentially the same. It just isn't causing your life total to change because, of course, your life total can't change, right? Also, commander damage works here as well. Again, the damage will not cause your life total to change, but commander damage will still kill your opponent if they have a Platinum Empyrean in play, if you can manage to get that count to 21. Now, let's look at Teferi's Protection, which is a little bit different because Teferi's Protection says your life total can't change, but it also says you have protection from everything. So those scenarios won't work here, and the reason why is because when you have protection from something, damage is prevented. So if I swing in again with my flying lifelink creature to my opponent who has resolved a Teferi's Protection, I'm not going to gain any life now because the damage that I would deal is being prevented. So of course I'm not going to gain anything off of it. Again, the commander damage scenario doesn't work because the damage is being prevented. However, if you have a scenario where something says you can't prevent damage, that is an actual way to get around this because that is what protection is doing. So if I'm going to swing in with my Voltron commander, my opponent casts a Teferi's Protection in response because I'm about to do them 21 commander damage, I can then respond by casting my Bone Crusher Giant, or more importantly, the adventure side Stomp, which says damage can't be prevented this turn. So that's going to make it so that the protection isn't going to stop me from dealing damage. It won't be prevented. Also, again, the life total can't change thing doesn't matter when it comes to commander damage. So I will still kill my opponent in that very rare scenario. Also, if I'm playing my Questing Beast deck, right? Questing Beast actually works really good against Teferi's Protection because of course it says combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented. So if my opponent casts that Teferi's Protection, of course their life total can't change, but again, I still can kill them with commander damage. So I get in with my Questing Beast. The damage that my commander is dealing can't be prevented. I won't change their life total, but if I get to that 21 commander damage, I will still kill them. Very interesting scenario there that a lot of people probably are not aware of. But that is it. That is all. Just some more rules that you might be misunderstanding understanding, might be getting wrong. Some things can be a little confusing here. And again, I like to answer your guys' questions if you have any. So if you have any questions about certain interactions, feel free to leave them in the comments below and I will answer them in the next video. But that is it for today. And thanks for tuning in.